technical definition, and even the definitions that we have are rather vague. And this vagueness is part of the protective attribute of the definition of privacy, but it makes it very difficult to translate into systems. But as computer scientists, we do have to make this translation at some point if this is the problem we want to solve. I open a bracket here within computer science. If you want to do anything political, you call it privacy, and that's how you get funding. Close bracket. So the thing that we try to do within SPION is to do this translation of the different privacy issues and see how we can address them in the systems. Okay. And we want to do this also critically, because just because you're developing a privacy design doesn't mean you're doing something good. It could be that your privacy design actually has some pretty bad ideas in it, or some problematic ones. Now let's start with this one, for example, your mother's maiden name. How many of you would maybe imagine or think that this is important personal information, or you have been told to protect this information like it's very, very important? Would you put your hands up if you've heard this before? Yes. Okay, let's come to the history of your mother's maiden name, and this is not going to be a genealogical one. Let's start with banks. So in the past, a few decades ago, we used to have banks which were in buildings, and basically they stored our assets, mostly money, and they were secured by, the guys with the guns in front, or some security systems, and there was, the big case, the case where the money was locked, which was material for a lot of good films, etc. But what we're seeing right now is that banks are moving into online banking, which means that that security is moving into the online environment. What then happens is security is no longer just the responsibility of the bank, but it also becomes the responsibility of all the customers of that bank. And they are then basically exposed to a problem called identity theft. So the users are now co-responsible for the security of the bank. And in order to do that, they need to use a bunch of security mechanisms developed by very smart people who have done a long education in security engineering and encryption, and then have developed these solutions. It turns out not all the customers are aware of these educational potentials, and they have to kind of come to grasp with these complex encryption systems that secure the bank. And because they have these problems, the engineers then have to come up with another solution called security questions. In case you cannot deal with the encryption methods that have been applied or the password model, there's a little help, which is a security question, which includes, what is your mother's maiden name? So what we now have is bank customers who have to protect this information, your mother's maiden name.
Someone's going to realize the extent of your information.
It turns out that you now have to protect your mother's maiden name, and you're told that this is a privacy problem and that this is personal information that you should keep secret. And it turns out your mother's maiden name is actually publicly available information. Okay, so what we call this is a typical example of responsibilization in design. And what I mean by that, generally what responsibilization means, it's actually coming from policing studies. It's any process whereby subjects are rendered individually responsible for a task, in this case mitigating risks, which previously would have been the duty of another. And generally it happens in neoliberal systems, in which organizations are going into automation of their processes and workflows and rationalizing their organizations, like in the case of banks, which are closing their branches and moving into the online environment, where the risks that they externalize as a result of these processes are pushed onto the individuals in those systems who are now subject to those risks.